Hello, everyone. It is 4:30 p.m. Central Time, and we are going to get started. All participants are muted, and if you are having any technical difficulties, we recommend disconnecting from the webinar and reconnecting. For questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature, and we will answer them throughout the talk. Thank you for joining the AAN Trainee and Faculty Networking webinar series. Today's topic is working with industry as a neurologist. I am pleased to introduce our panel members for today. Our moderator is Dr. Williams Roberson, is an assistant professor in the departments of neurology and biomedical engineering at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. We have our panelists, Dr. Shih, Dr. Southerland, and Dr. Schneider. Dr. Shih is an associate professor of neurology at Boston University School of Medicine, director of the Residency Research Track and Deep Brain Stimulation Program at Boston Medical Center. Dr. Southerland is a Harrison Distinguished Teaching Professor and Associate Professor of Neurology and Public Health Sciences at the University of Virginia. And Dr. Schneider is the clinical lead for sleep health at Alphabet, consultant neurologist at Stanford VA Alzheimer's Research Center, and clinical assistant professor affiliated of sleep medicine at the Stanford Sleep Center. Dr. Williams Roberson, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for all of the panelists for being here today. Thanks also to the attendees for joining in. I'm looking forward to a very interesting and exciting discussion this afternoon about a topic that is very rarely talked about in the context of our neurology training. I'd like to start it off by asking each of the panelists to give us a few minutes of background about your sort of trajectory and your interactions, particularly your interactions with industry. And then we'll move on after that to some questions. And we'll invite the participants to place questions in the chat or however you'd like to to raise issues or questions you'd like to hear discussed. Dr. Schneider, can I start with you? Would you be interested in sharing a little bit about your background?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So my background is mentioned in my intro. I'm a sleep and cognitive neurologist, but currently am involved much more in tech and industry, as well as associated and work with pharma in various capacities. So I guess the common thread behind all of the things that got me to where I am in a much more atypical path is just being open to discussion. One of the things that you're often told is to avoid at all costs any interaction with pharmaceutical companies in training, particularly with the Sunshine Act coming into play. And my thought was, well, if I'm in bed with everybody, then I'm in bed with nobody. And also I know how to make decisions. You trained me for that, not to be controlled by pharma companies. So the way I originally engaged with pharma was through just talking to the MSLs, the medical science liaisons, because they weren't trying to have me sell a drug. They were just informing me and seeking my input. And through that, eventually, my information's free to them and their information was free to me. And so I was learning about their medications and how they were trying to position them for indications. And they eventually thought that I was, knowledgeable about the areas that I was interested in, particularly through engaging with them, and that ended up getting me put onto advisory boards, which was a more distant relationship from the drug talk circuit, but essentially helped them navigate strategy and ideas, and then that eventually rolled into additionally being on speakers bureaus. So there's the conflict of interest aspect in the sense that I do speak on behalf of drug companies. I get paid to do so. In order to hawk their drugs to various clinicians, but in essence, don't let that bleed into the other aspects of either educating trainees or even speaking at meetings, obviously disclosing all my conflicts of interest and just presenting the data as my objective. And then on a similar vein, which is now really my main capacity over at Alphabet as the sleep lead, or clinical sleep lead, is, again, I was just talking to people in Silicon Valley. Lots of tech companies want to disrupt medicine, in particular sleep medicine. It's kind of like a gray zone between consumer and clinical. And so just talked to a bunch of people until finally found a company that was like, oh, these people seem to have a different perspective on things. Started advising them more closely, and then they got acquired by Google. And so that's essentially how I helped advise them on a sleep product that eventually turned into a position to actually really help them do more with sleep, both clinically and research-wise. So it's really just open discussions, getting information. It flows both ways. It's free. Nobody can act on your intelligence because you are kind of you have all of this knowledge, even if it seems so simply distilled into discussions with either patients or industry or tech or pharma. You can actually realize that you can say as much as you want, but people don't have the understanding of what it takes to actually execute and implement that. And so it's worth learning, I feel, to have open discussions. That's what we did throughout all of training, is find the right answers through exposure to that information. So, but different people have different perspectives and don't want to force you one way or the other, but that's my journey.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Southerland, would you care to share and give us some of your hints and pearls of wisdom?
Sure. No, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel with such a great group here, and all the attendees for your interest on this topic. I found this to be a challenging topic for me personally, both in my relationships with industry, and then also in some management of relationships with industry. As the introduction suggested, I'm a neurologist here at the University of Virginia, a vascular and stroke neurologist, and I'm also a residency program director. And so my interactions with industry really cross both my divide as an academic neurologist and relationships I have doing industry-sponsored clinical research, as well as some role in evaluating at an institution-wide level industry-related educational activities for our trainees, our residents and fellows at UVA. And I'm sure at other similar institutions out there for any of the trainees, there are committees and organizations at the institution level and within the GME administrative infrastructure that is evaluating these activities out there as well. So I'll just speak briefly to my own personal interactions. So I have had the chance to be a PI and a site investigator for a number of industry-sponsored clinical trials. And I think that the more intimate you are in the development of those clinical trials, the protocol development, the data analysis, and actually the interactions one-on-one with the industry team, the executives, the financial officers, the chief scientific officers at the company, then you get more of an eye-opening look at how the sausage is made, so to speak, when it comes to doing clinical research from an industry point of view. And what's been interesting for me over time is being able to work with both small companies as well as very large companies that are doing large multi-center phase 3 clinical trials. But I've enjoyed the most the smaller companies that I've had a chance to interact with, who are doing early phase 2, even some phase 1 early human clinical research on novel drugs and devices. And in that context, there are financial incentives on the back end of every industry-related activity. But hopefully your goal as somebody who's interested in science and wants to utilize that partnership to advance research, that you can sort of do your best to divest yourself of those financial interests and work together in collaboration towards the goal of the scientific research. But what I think I've learned the most is that you can't just sort of erase from your mind that there are financial incentives in play, because if you do, then I think you lose touch with the levers that need to be pulled and considered when you're trying to make sure that the research is successful if you really believe in it. And so I'll just share a quick example as an investigator with a small company doing a clinical trial. That the company had put a lot of their eggs in this particular basket from a financial point of view, and the trial bled into the sort of the pandemic and a lot of the financial challenges, both in academia as well as in industry, that came along with the pandemic. And so we were right in the middle of this clinical trial. A lot of work and time and energy had gone into that. We were helping support our clinical research coordinators through industry-sponsored support. And then all of a sudden, the company just within a week decided they were going to shut down the trial. Just sorry, we had an investor meeting and our board says that we're no longer going to do this trial that we had been spending years developing and building a team around and developing a local network to conduct the research. And then all of a sudden, and overnight, that's gone. And so that's a real challenge. And so I think you have to sort of have some awareness of that when you're working with groups that are not only invested in the science itself and the feasibility of doing the research, such as working with the NIH and scientific organizations and sponsors, but also particularly when you're working with industry. So that's just one example, and I can go into more details later in the Q&A. And the other role is sort of overseeing industry-related educational activities. That's been really interesting for me because I've had to learn a lot about legislative policy that regulates that and influences that at academic institutions. And that brings in the policy, the open payments policy through Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, which seeks to sort of report out on industry-supported activity for physicians and people in academic institutions as well. And also the Sunshine Act, which is something we can talk about today, which is, I'm sure for my colleagues and for many people on the panel recognize, which is a piece of legislation where industry is required to report any dollar provided to a physician, to have that as openly reported. Originally intended to disincentivize those activities for people that sought to keep that out of the public eye. But that's a challenging piece of legislation because it really mixes what are probably significant financial relationships with industry, which what are likely trivial financial relationships, such as if you're at a national meeting and you go grab a sandwich at the AAN, for instance, and some company paid for that sandwich, and all of a sudden, if you signed up for that sandwich, your name gets on some industry log somewhere. So I think understanding how all that works is important as well, and particularly important for trainees and people like me in residency training and so forth that are trying to help protect folks from that. So I'll pause there. I know that was a lot of intro, and look forward to further discussion as we get into it.
That was fantastic intro. Thank you very much. Dr. Shih, would you like to share? You worked a little bit in industry, right? As well. And now we're back in academia.
That's right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. And it's been great to hear also Dr. Schneider and Dr. Southerland's experiences as well. By way of introduction, I'm obviously a neurologist. I have trained in movement disorders, did my training at the Harvard Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center program and was on faculty there for a number of years. And I will say that I've touched industry in a few different ways. And I will say that people will sometimes approach me with questions in really pertaining around a couple of areas that I'll sort of highlight here as it may trigger some additional discussion. One actually has been around people who are interested in potentially having a career in industry, particularly if they are doing clinical work, but also really enjoy clinical research or translational research. And they want to know a little bit more about how to sort of extend their interests into doing more of that kind of work in their day-to-day job. Another area where I get questions are about how to support one's work that they're doing in academia through, it's like these days you need a diverse portfolio of possible funding sources. And increasingly people are thinking that maybe industry is an area that might support my work, especially in the area of neurologic therapeutics. I mean, it's just an amazing time to be a neurologist because there are a lot of advances in knowledge that are starting to translate into some therapies. And we need people to know how to execute studies that will give us more information about whether those therapies will be helpful. But also sometimes we need to know the basics about how that disease mechanism actually works. And you could be a clinician scientist running a lab or a clinician investigator working in biomarkers or epidemiology or what have you. There are some real gaps in knowledge, and industry is keenly looking to help fill those gaps in knowledge. And so that's another area that people come in and talk to me about because of the experiences I've had when I was also trying to help develop neurologic therapeutics for neurodegenerative diseases and movement disorders and neuromuscular disorders. So I'll just leave it at that and kind of give Dr. Roberson a chance to sort of guide us through some questions.
Sure, super. Thank you again very much. I'm just keeping an eye out on the chat. So my first question is particularly for Dr. Schneider and Dr. Shih. Can you go into some more detail just in terms of the pros and cons that you considered or maybe should have considered as you made a transition from a primarily academic role into a primarily industry-based role? What were some of the concerns that you had or unknowns that you had, and kind of what did you find out as you went along in your experience?
Dr. Schneider, do you want to go first, or do you want me?
You can go ahead.
Okay, good. Okay. So, I will say that this was not necessarily something I was planning, but and sometimes I think it's a little bit of your circumstances and where you are. And I was sitting here in Boston and reading a lot of the advances that were happening in neurologic therapeutics. And around the time that I was starting to think about this, we had seen the successful development of nusinersen or Spinraza for spinal muscular atrophy. And there was increasingly genetic technology to think about addressing, serious neurologic diseases, especially with ones that are highly heritable, or the ones in which the genetic lesion is really well known and mostly understood. And the other thing, I think, for me as a clinician who was also doing research, it's sometimes you want to understand, how your work is going to translate into something that will be useful to a patient someday. And what I was getting from folks who were interested in me was that I had disease expertise in an area that, although they had neurologists in the company, and good ones and good neuroscientists as well, it was helpful for them to have an internal sounding board. Certainly companies will interface and use a lot of external advisory boards, but some of the companies really, not all companies are in a position to do this, but some companies are really dedicated to making sure they have in-house expertise in a particular area. And I think this was the situation I found myself in. And to me, it just sounded like something that I would learn from. In my life, when I have looked back at decisions I've made, I've often asked myself, am I going to learn from this? And will I enjoy learning something new? And that's I think what drove part of that decision making for me. And actually, it was a very positive experience in many ways, which I won't. I'll give some time to Dr. Schneider to also talk about as well. But I think for folks who are thinking about it, there are some special things to think about, and it's kind of got to match the opportunities that are actually out there.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think all of that is very insightful. I was taking some notes as you were going along. In fact, one of the things actually that you brought up that I thought certainly weighs heavily into the decision to transition over to industry, whatever that is the thing that you mentioned, kind of balancing it either as a uncertainty or as learning something new. Because particularly going into these different worlds where you haven't been trained to do it. I mean, your entire training through residency is never poised at how do you actually work in this kind of a world? How do you actually be judged against a different set of metrics than the standard macro type of metrics that were judged, or likelihood to refers that you're judged at in your clinical practice? So it does have a large degree of uncertainty, and you wonder, will I be able to thrive or survive in this environment? But the nice part is generally when you're going there, you're being recruited because of the expertise that you have, and you've been very adaptable at dealing with very complex and challenging situations, that if you look at it as an opportunity to learn a new skill set, that's certainly something that helps make that a worthwhile transition. And every day I'm learning something new, and you work alongside a lot of very intelligent people, not to say that you don't in any other capacity, but people with diverse skill sets that are far beyond your scope, that it's very humbling every day. Epidemiologists or statisticians, if you're at a pharma company, to machine learning experts like in tech. One of the other things that also weighed on that was this sense of loss, right? You're stepping away from a life that you knew with a question, will I ever be able to go back? And one good aspect about that, is I think Dr. Shih's story will tell you, is that you do come away with a new skill set that is complementary and valuable to, if you wanted to go back into a primary clinical practice or in an academic setting, that I certainly think it gives you a unique background that helps educate trainees, as well as make your practice more fulfilling, knowing the context of what goes on beyond the walls. But also you have to look at it, you are stepping away though from something which is the nature of the scale of your impact. So in clinic practice, you get to see on a one-to-one basis the impact that your decisions have on people's lives. And hopefully that's the reason why many of you got into medicine, and certainly the reason why I got into it. So you have to look at it maybe in the context of, well, this translation to the impact is going to affect thousands to millions to maybe even make the lives of billions of people healthier, as Google likes to say it's going to do. And so I think in that sense, you have to balance those different scales, but also even maybe able to approach a hybrid model, because you do want to maintain clinical competence. And so you can maintain that intimate in-person interaction with patients, but it's certainly something that you do step away from that world where every day you're making those impacts on people's lives. And then the last thing, sorry, just to keep talking, that I had to decide on is, and I think this is one of the most critical things, is it what you want to do? Because a lot of people, have to decide what their path is. Some people come in and they're like born to be the Nobel laureate, and they're charting their course to, I'm going to do this thing. And if that's your path, it could be in conflict with what industry is doing, because industry is a behemoth and you're a part of that. And you oftentimes don't have the autonomy that you have when you're deciding what to do in your lab as a PI. Granted, you have to go where the money is, but you still have a lot of autonomy. Whereas when you get into industry, you're more on the mission of the company. And the way I look at things is I'm more of a process improver. So I don't mind. I'm like the biostatistician. Everybody wants to consult me to do it. And I love whatever the riddle is, I can solve it. And that's what I like doing, is the process, not so much the exact steps to the goal that I have to be in mind of. So if that's your kind of tack, then you can fit into one of these teams and work toward the mission, because there is volatility. As Dr. Southerland said, the trial is gone, or Google has a reorg and now you're no longer actually working on X, Y, or Z project because it's no longer the company's priority. And so those are things that you have to be comfortable with if this is a path that you want to go to. So that drug may not have phase 3 data that's beneficial, and boom, there's no more whatever Alzheimer drug, for example. So you have to be cognizant of the fact that you don't have as much control of what you're doing in these capacities, and have to be more flexible there.
That's quite fair. And just jumping on that just for a little bit, because there's a question that came up vaguely related, somewhat related. Do you feel that even in that context, the scientific pursuit and the process is fairly satisfying to your current role, or are there things that you might change about that?
Well,
You want me to answer? Oh, okay, good.
yeah, maybe we both should, because I think you bring a really interesting and a diverse perspective from the tech side of things. I will say in biotech and pharma, I've been incredibly lucky. I think I worked for two places that really, really valued science. And I think that there was, it was in some ways a little bit, both places were fairly academic, I imagine, compared to some places. And so I'll say that as a caveat, not everybody's experience may be the same, but I would say that I found it quite satisfying. I had the chance to really sit and read. It was even in my own disease area that I was a clinical expert in, I learned a lot. And then I got to learn about other related diseases that were very similar, related topics, and some of the same themes. I mean, I think neurodegeneration is something that people like me are constantly dealing with in clinic, and we're, as a society, trying to figure out what to do and can we do anything about it. But getting back to like, what's a target? How do you identify that target? Has that target been validated? How's it been validated? What's your proof of biology? Okay, how do we get to a study that demonstrates some kind of proof of concept, or how are we going to know that this drug is actually reaching its target and doing what it's intended to do? Those are built into the process in some ways when you're developing compounds in early stage development. So that process is somewhat built in, because you can publish some data in a manuscript, but here it's either going to work or it's not going to work. And if you use scientific principles, you would hope you're going to get to greater chance of success. Certainly success in neurologic diseases is by no means a guarantee. But if we use our best, thinking hats, how are we going to get to the answer by using what we currently know? I found that to be quite fun. Yeah.
Neat, very neat. Go ahead.
Can I punt that to Dr. Southerland? He was alluding to being part of those early discussions of devising even phase 1 studies. So I think that is kind of right up what you're talking about, is the importance of being involved. So I want to hear your perspective.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I think first of all, I'm just sitting back like an attendee, getting to enjoy. I'm learning a lot too, and loving to hear your own individual experiences. I think I'll just add on to get to that answer, but then I was just going to add on sort of this concept that I don't think we do a fair job with trainees in residency and fellowship, certainly in medical school, of really exposing them to career pathways in industry. And I think some of that is because at an institutional level, there is this tension between wanting to shield them from conflicts of interest, or feeling somehow like we have to protect them, and we should, from undue influence and relationships with industry that may be cloaked in education. But at the same time, in doing so, we sort of build these walls to industry, particularly in academia. And therefore, when folks get out into the real world and they're not familiar with some of these career opportunities or pathways, unless you bump into a great role model like Dr. Schneider, Dr. Shih, and so I do think there's room for us to consider and develop, both locally and also nationally within our educational organizations in neurology. How do we expose folks to career pathways and opportunities for partnerships with industry, but maintaining those proper protections and addressing conflicts of interest and disclosures and so forth. So that's certainly something for us all to think about, and we can certainly talk about. As far as sort of my experience helping with early phase clinical trials, I really love that, because the small company, even though I sort of, threw them under the bus, they pulled the funding in our clinical trial. It was really awesome to see their enthusiasm for really wanting to figure out how to take this drug that they had, that they felt like they really had this promising pharmacologic, and try to figure out, as Dr. Shih was saying, how do we develop a clinical trial that we can really answer the question of, is there there that we can convince our investors to build more money, so that we could then hopefully take it to a larger phase clinical trial. And they had the drug, and they had the infrastructure and the financial support, but they really had very little experience in how to at that level, compared to, say, a larger company, in how to run a clinical trial. And in this case, it was a pre-hospital trial, and so sort of a novel clinical trial, even in an academic environment. And so we had access to sort of the patients and the infrastructure to be able to help guide them in developing the clinical trial. And so that was a lot of fun, because they really did, and the similar is, if we were in-house scientific consultants, but as a small company, they didn't have that real option. So they were sort of partnering with us externally. So we had the opportunity to really shape and mold this novel clinical trial for this novel drug. And that was really exciting, and probably had more autonomy to do that than we would have working with a more regulated sort of federal sponsor or society-based sponsor. And so to me, that was the really cool part about working with this company, is they sort of gave us carte blanche to sort of help build this clinical trial, help develop it, and help take it forward. And I think in different circumstance environment, we could really get there. And even now, I think once you develop those relationships, they're always there. And so, you're always getting an email or contact saying, hey, we had this idea for how we could do this with our drug. What do you think about that? Or, what could we, who could you put us in contact with that could do this? And so to me, it really diversifies your experience as someone interested in both, developing clinical trials and testing new drugs and devices, but also in how to get those to patients sooner, because I think that's where industry can really machine up the advance of science in that regard. And I agree with Dr. Shih, for the most part, most all the folks I've worked with in industry, short of the every now and then a meeting with the chief financial officer, most of these folks are really in it for the science in and of itself, and not necessarily for the investors and the board. So I think it can be really fun, and if it's done the right way and you're smart about it. I think Dr. Schneider said something earlier, in our panel discussion, and then, which I think is just really important, is whatever you do in any relationship, as long as you're open about it and you disclose it, you're doing everything you can from an ethical standpoint to make sure everybody's aware of whatever the relationship is or whatever the partnership is. And then it's up to others to sort of judge whether that's influential or whatnot. And then it, of course, is regulated by your whatever organization or institution you work for. But the key thing is just to make sure it's all disclosed and so forth, which is important.
So I want to sort of add to that or capitalize on your expertise in terms of sort of monitoring for those relationships. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some examples of industry-related educational activities that that you've come across that are okay versus not okay? Sort of where do you draw the line? I see there's a question about why is there discrepancy between neurologists accepting a sandwich versus the surgeons getting the entire social event sponsored by industry? I mean, how does different institutions, I know probably do it differently, but can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been in that regard?
Well, I'll say to sort of the discrepancy between some of our surgical colleagues and those of us in neurology or non-surgical fields is some of it is just in the general kind of culture. For instance, the meetings we would have at a GME-wide level about evaluating certain educational activities, partnerships with industry, you can imagine the partnership, the perception of my colleagues in orthopedics was very different than the perception of my colleagues in pediatrics or internal medicine. And so some of it's just the general culture. I mean, if you're in a device-heavy specialty such as ortho or plastic surgery, or you probably don't go to the operating room unless there's a representative from industry in that operating room with you. And I've had surgical colleagues say that we couldn't even do the operation unless the device rep was in there to show us how to use the screw or the hammer or the joint or whatnot. And is that good or bad? Or I don't know, but it certainly is imperative to the feasibility to provide good clinical care in the OR in that context. And similarly with some of the subspecialties within neurology, obviously there's going to be more opportunity for relationships with industry. And so some of that's going to be built into the culture of it. And so the discrepancy really lies within perceptions and then the way, and then hopefully there'd be more universal sort of regulatory environment that would treat everybody the same, regardless of what subspecialty they're in. But a meeting is going to be different, whether it's a neurology national meeting versus an orthopedic national meeting as it relates to industry and so forth. Getting back into sort of some of the good examples, I think we all have sort of seen the really good examples where, there are a lot of research scholarships out there that are sponsored by industry to support residents in training to do research. And there are a lot of scholarships out there and travel awards that are sponsored by industry to allow residents and fellows to attend national meetings and attend educational sessions. And so I think that is money that would not otherwise be there if not for that industry support. I mean, there obviously are research awards and travel awards sponsored by the American Academy of Neurology, which are fantastic. There are travel awards, research awards, and sponsorships from the NIH, et cetera, but there's always a limited allocation of those. And so why wouldn't we want to tap into whatever resources were at our disposal to broaden the educational experiences for our trainees, whether it's to conduct research or to attend a meeting or to gain some educational knowledge. The key is just, again, to look in the fine print, if it's sponsored by industry, to see if there are conflicts or motives that are not designed towards the purity of that educational activity. And I guess what I mean by that is you want to see, is this unrestricted money that's going to be used for this person to conduct this research or to participate in this educational activity, this meeting, or is there a requirement here that's somehow going to require you to, when you go to the national meeting, attend a dinner to hear about a certain drug? Is that a goal to try to pull more people into the influence of a certain company's motivations? And that's where you get into the evaluating it on its face and what the money's being used for and so forth. Is the research being driven towards a particular area, and that's why that grant's being provided, or is it really allowing that person to do research that's sort of unfettered? So I think there's plenty of good examples. I think it just has to be looked at in detail and monitored in an objective way. And then I think we need to provide good conflict of interest training for our trainees and our students. I think that's something that we get a paucity of in training, and some institutions probably do it really well, but a lot of times it's, you take a 5-minute multiple choice test once a year, and so there's a couple of conflict of interest questions in there, and that counts as kind of conflict of interest training, but that's probably not good enough.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel as though as young researchers, if folks have a specific interest in pursuing pursuing research, then conflict of interest training is, is almost mandated. But it's really something that should probably be across the board for all of us during our neurology training, just because it's going to come up. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the mechanics of establishing sort of what are the steps that you took as an early faculty member in terms of getting connected to industry to start clinical trials? Like, what does that actually look like, and how do those relationships become established?
Dr. Shih or Dr. Schneider want to jump into that as well, or?
So I'm tag teaming off of something that Dr. Schneider said earlier in terms of just open communication and talking to other folks. And there was a question that was raised in the Q&A about kind of, there's being somewhat of a wall between academia and industry, and when is it appropriate to start having those kinds of conversations. But then I guess my thought process is also, there's having a conversation, and then there's a step that goes beyond that to say, let's start a clinical trial. But how does that happen for someone who is, who is maybe so maybe not a trainee, but just a junior faculty member, just getting their feet wet and learning the environment?
Sure. I'll just touch on it briefly. I think that, once it goes from, let's say I'm at a meeting and I'm walking around the industry floor and somebody says, hey, you work at X institution. We're bringing insights to a clinical trial of X drug for the neurological disease that you're an expert in. We'd love for you to be a site in our clinical trial. Great. That sounds really exciting. Give me your card and let's have an email conversation about it. And then I think you're talking, Dr. Roberson, you're talking about sort of what's that next step then if you're saying, okay, well, now I actually want to try to be a site in this trial. I think there's several groups at any institution that you're going to then need to sort of pull in to that conversation, which include grants and contracts. Probably first and foremost is sort of what is going to be the contractual relationship with this company. What is going to be your role? Are you going to be given a research grant to then be the investigator, or are you going to be paid as a consultant to help that company then conduct a clinical trial? And those are sort of two different types of contracts that you may have at a faculty level. And then there's going to be sort of the regulatory environment. Both if you're going to be a site, then you're obviously going to be regulated by the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board, which is going to evaluate sort of the ethics of the relationship in the clinical trial, and then sponsored programs, which is going to come in and look at that as well. So I think there's several groups within research and then also within the legal regulatory environment at an institution before anything would actually go forward to sign off on.
So really kind of knowing the landscape around your institution and the people to the people whose expertise you can tap into to help you sort of navigate those next steps is probably key.
But as a first year faculty member right out of fellowship, you're not going to know who all those people are. So I think the more practical response is find someone in your department who has done this before. If you're at a place that's fortunate enough to have like a CTSA sponsored, clinical translational award, there are going to be people there that sort of their whole job is to kind of try to develop these partnerships and relationships for translational research. And at the end of the day, you really need a good mentor who's had experience in this, and they can sort of guide you to the steps, tell you who those people are, how to get in contact with them. And that's how it happened for me. I was fortunate to have Karen Johnston, who was my former chair, who had a lot of experience with this. And so you don't just wake up one day out of residency or fellowship and know who all these groups are. So that's really important.
To add to that, I don't know about you, Andy, but you probably had built up a little bit of a track record of your own academic interests and publication record and getting stuff done. And so I would say, to the person who asked the question, it isn't often the case that a company will reach out to someone very junior. It will often look to establish partnerships with people who are thought to be, pretty pretty expert in their field and maybe have a track record of getting a lot of research done, because in the end, if it's a research agreement between the two parties, their industry is going to be looking to investigators who can really deliver on a scientific milestone that's going to benefit both parties, but for their program at the end of the line, that is what matters at the end of the day. So in terms of these like sort of more specials or research collaborations, outside of multi-center clinical trials, that very, I would say in my experience, that is heavily factored in. And so it may be good as a junior person to tag along with maybe someone senior who's getting into this, so that you can kind of see how things are working. And at least that's been my experience, that it's not often the very junior person who's establishing the research collaborations, unless, maybe it's someone who's got a really stellar track record in the lab, but is now getting to their first faculty position.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Dr. Schneider?
Yeah, I think that those are some good points. And there's a common theme that I want to highlight here, one of which you highlighted is if somebody's reaching out to you as an unknown name, not a key opinion leader in the field, and wants to do a trial, you have to recognize what is the intention, right? Somebody's always trying to get something. And in this case, they're trying to use your access to something, maybe patients, your brand equity, either you as a clinician and being the authority on their advisory board, or your brand equity through your institution, right? So those higher tier institutions are very protective of whether or not you can use that name in any capacity beyond their walls. And so that's one thing to be aware of, though sometimes there are situations where they just found you because you've been outspoken. Like in my case, I actively engaged with MSLs, which is different than the farm reps. Again, the MSLs are the people who have the medical information, and they can't talk about indications or try and share a drug with you. And so in those capacities, I realized I needed to get the training that training didn't give me, right? Because as soon as you leave, you're now basically bait in the water and a bunch of sharks are circling around to try and get you to sell their drug, right? And what is training for but to make the mistakes, stumble, and have a safety net of context where the attending's like, no, that's silly, let's not do that. That answer might be, that drug is not appropriate for these reasons, here's that clinical context. But if we shield you, and then you just go out into the real world, it's like, whoa, all these people want to give me trips and blah, 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 and have me eat these dinners and sell and use this drug, then inherently you don't get the training you need in the safety net capacity of training to make informed decisions. Now, hopefully you're all trained and competent enough to make those decisions, but it's one of those things I think from a training capacity, from the abuses of the past where people would get a week's vacation to Hawaii to do a talk, and then the Sunshine Act causing the pendulum to swing back to now we're going to shut off the walls and now you're going to go out incompetent when it comes to interacting with the world outside. I think we have to find a middle ground, but that is one aspect. The other aspect is what you were all talking about, in which we're talking about where you may be involved in a clinical trial because they need access to patients. They don't have that otherwise. But there are ways that you, if you were talking to an MSL, they might float the idea, obviously recognize it's toward the end of they're trying to get an indication, or they have something that they want to share with the community, be it even if it's an educational and non-branded talk. They have an objective, get this drug into patients and get paid for it. So always bear that in mind, even when it comes to reading studies, right? When you do journal club, hopefully you go right down to the bottom and look at that conflicts of interest section and say, is this a drug sponsored study? That's the first step that you should be doing in any context. But then MSLs might say, we have investigator sponsored trials, or ITTs or ISTs, these ones where you actually float an idea to them, just like a grant application. And if they feel it fits within their mission and vision, then you actually can get funded to do a study. So it's similar to a standard grant application. It doesn't have to come to you. You can actually apply for them. So I think it's one of those things where talking to people, again, does not cause harm. It's the point at which you actually are starting to do things that then bias you in an implicit or explicit way and change your practice and behaviors without you disclosing that. And so in that sense, I think it's important for us to engage early so that we are trained with people overseeing, like a good mentor who's like, this is how you engage with industry to get the grants that fund your research career in a way that doesn't promote conflicts of interest. But if you're not doing that in residency or doing that in your PhD or postdoc or what have you, when are you going to do it? It's going to be very ad hoc and you might make a misstep. That's where I feel like having oversight and training to do it is probably the safest possible way. Just like we don't send you out there like you've never done TPA, but guess what? There's a TPA thing that you can do. Surprise, figure out how it works on the fly. And that's not how we should be doing any part of training, is my thought. But, you know.
Absolutely. Speaking of training, there's a very interesting question by Robert Eisinger. How can we facilitate and reward even industry-related scholarly activity during residency training? I feel, Dr. Southerland, you mentioned that earlier. Do you envision a possibility for protected time during the PGY 3 or 4 year to pursue industry-related internships, for example?
That is that's an interesting question, and obviously something that I think industry would love is in many cases, which is the ability to have a trainee come and really intern with them with the idea that they would be someone that would, at best, you know, really become a key scientific partner or clinical partner for them going forward, but at the least would have affinity for that company and the drug or device, you know, that they were working with or doing research. I think the challenge there from a GME perspective is, you know, if it's external to the institution where someone is training, like actually going and working at a company doing research, then it's almost like taking an independent research year, and who is going to pay for that position during that year? If industry is going to be paying for that position, then you're almost sort of stepping out of the normal paid GME environment at that point. At the same time, the alternative is to get a stipend, and this is in existence, a company providing a stipend to basically fund a position in a training program, and you'll see that a lot with fellowships, and particularly in surgical fellowships and so forth, where industry is providing an unrestricted funding for a fellowship position or a training position. But I think this question is really more, you know, could someone do an internship with a company during their training? And I don't know the answer to that outside the context of an established research grant partnership between the institution and the company, and because I think that would likely not be approved in most GME environments or institutions from a regulatory standpoint. But that's an area that I think is definitely worth considering going forward. Because I completely agree with everything Dr. Schneider just said. I think that we work so hard to shield folks in training, you know, from industry in some ways, that we expose them to lack of experience when they get out of training and how they interact with industry, and obviously again, and if they're pursuing careers in industry. But those are my thoughts on that particular topic.
Yeah, I'll just add a note here too. It has struck me also, it's quite interesting. I think residents are, I'm always amazed. I think everyone just keeps getting smarter and smarter as the generations go by, and the residents are looking to apply for funding while they're residents and do research and already get going. And we have some, you know, NIH funded mechanisms for that. For example, R25s are at some institutions. But outside of that, you're right, there's not, you know, maybe your part of your work during residency is related to a mentor, faculty mentor at your institution who already has some industry connections, and there's already some partnerships that are underway, and you're able to do some really innovative work on top of that. I wasn't sure from the question if you felt like that was somehow penalized, and the question was more like, how can that be recognized as equal to or just as prestigious as federal funding? I think there's always going to be that little bit of stigma, but in the end, at the end of the day, like the work needs to stand on its own in a peer-reviewed forum, and particularly around. And I have to say, we haven't really talked about this yet, but I do want to highlight for the group that in some ways, there are two wings of a company when it comes to engaging with academics. You have your research and development wing, and then you have your medical affairs wing. And these are often to support products that are already approved and marketed, and they're often trying to figure out how best to use the product, if I can use a euphemism there. In research and development, you're often going to be talking, people there are going to be really highly technical and thinking about how to even just get this thing to work. Does it even work? And how do I, use my best scientific knowledge or engineering knowledge to figure out like this is going to be successful in potentially helping patients. And so that distinction kind of needs to be made. I think, I'm not sure because I'm not in the main line of sort of the residency and the ACGME policies, but I imagine that there could be something there that would have to be looked at on a institutional basis in terms of whether industry can actually support residents doing research. But that being said, there has been, and I think there's been a recognized need even by NIH that physicians, we do need to train more physicians to be the people who will bring forward new therapeutics, whether that's in engineering or molecules or what have you. And I think that we're going to see more fellowships, I think, aligned with this purpose. There are, in addition to the ones that Dr. Schneider is mentioning, where in general, industry may sponsor, with unrestricted educational grants, fellowships. Some fellowships are not ACGME accredited, meaning those fellowship directors need to scramble to find the money somehow to support their fellows. That's one thing, but there are also dedicated fellowships in which people will spend time in a company and be 50% at the company and 50% at the institution. The fellowships at MGH and with Biogen and Takeda are good examples of this. And then I think NIH has started to put out more T32s that are aimed at training fellows to get a little bit of therapeutics development experience, how to not just do your postdoc in a basic science lab, but how do you really get some training so that you can take your ideas and it could potentially be developed into something that would be usable by a larger population. So I think it's increasingly being recognized. I don't think I think we'll be seeing that these pathways to further developing the work are also as valid as long as they stand up, in peer-reviewed forums.
And one other, so that raises also for me, or reminds me also of another sort of group or office within folks' institutions that can be a resource, and that's the sort of innovations or intellectual property type office. More and more these days, institutions are developing whole groups or centers around, helping to move ideas from the ideas phase into the, let's facilitate getting this out and, potentially launching our own, not nonprofit, what's the word? Launching our own type of small business to put those out. Small companies, exactly. And so those can also be good resources, right? For doing such things.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, Dr. Roberson, because I was going to say the same thing, that is another great way. I've actually worked with trainees before who, both students and residents, who wanted to develop a company or had an idea for a company based on some research that they were involved in. And we talked about this earlier in the panel, but in that context, they were sort of learning research in their medical education, but when they graduated, they wanted to start their own company. And so in doing so, we had to have conversations with, my institution is called the Licensing and Ventures Group, and they negotiate on the relationship between a small startup company and the essentially the interests which are under the ownership of the institution, even though they're individuals doing that research. Anything that's spun out of the institution is quote owned by the institution and it's all protected. But they can form licensing partnerships with a small company, so then that intellectual property then can be used by the company for commercialization purposes. And I think that's a really healthy way to, if people are interested in entrepreneurship and developing companies and going in that kind of line of work, working with an innovation officer or licensing group. But that is an area where you also really need to. There's a lot to learn when it comes to company development and licensing and startup and how do you go about product development and all that and market. And so I would encourage folks that are interested in that to consider these particular folks that were my trainees did the NSF's I-Core program, NIH has similar programs, and a lot of institutions have similar programs in their business schools and the partnerships they have with the schools of medicine to help understand how you would develop a company, how you would do that from an entrepreneurship standpoint. And so those are great opportunities. And then in addition to that, the NIH grants that facilitate partnerships between industry and research, small business partnerships, which are the STTR and SBIR grant mechanisms through NIH, are also ones to be aware of, and most institutions have familiarity with how to apply for those and be eligible for those from company standpoint, and then how to partner with researchers in an academic institution.
Yes, that's great. Absolutely. Thank you. We are getting close to the end of the hour. There was one other question that I wanted to point out in the Q&A, and it goes back to something that we were talking about very much earlier in terms of communicating with, sort of just establishing relationships and communicating with industry. I think that you can communicate or get to know industry reps at, for example, the AAN annual meeting, when there's, all sorts of expositions and whatnot. But how do you go beyond just meeting with a rep and get to the MSL? Dr. Schneider, you mentioned the medical science liaison a few times. How do you connect? What's the mechanics of connecting with the MSL?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, the FDA has made that very easy. So when you go to these booths, there will be the entire glitzy come and get your cookie component. And on the other side, tucked away in a corner, physically separated, are the MSLs. Those are the people who are the science people, who are there to talk about the science, can help reference papers that they may have done that are not part of an FDA label indication, but are part of the research and evidence base that may or may not have supported an indication in X, Y, or Z for the drug. And so those are the people who you can talk to. Anytime you see a pharma presentation that's branded about the drug, there's always the disclaimer at the beginning. If you have questions that are off the label of what the FDA indicates, that's the medical information team. That's where the MSLs really come into play. And those are the people that if you want to talk about science and geek out about, well, how is this new mechanism working? They'll talk to you about that. And they're not allowed to talk to you about trying to use the drug or indications for it, except for what is actually acceptable and published, but they're not like a pharmaceutical representative. They're always physically separate. In fact, you can't have a meeting with an MSL and a pharma rep at the same time. It's against FDA protocol. So in essence, there is that world of just the science that you get to talk to these people about, and it's physically separated every time you have to encounter a pharmaceutical company. So just look behind at that little corner where there seem to be just two people standing there, normally a PharmD, maybe a physician as well, or a PhD, who actually have all of the knowledge that's tappable, and then everything else on the other side is what's on the label.
Do you take the cookie or do you bypass the cookie, Dr. Schneider, to get to the...
You grab the cookie on the way and say, I'm going to go talk to the MSL. And then you just boop, 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 or I can't prescribe.
Or I can't prescribe.
Or something. Or I just go to every neuro conference, say I'm a sleep physician, and they're like, oh, sleep? We don't have indication for that. I'm like, sorry.
Take the cookie, take the espresso. I'm a sleep physician, and then go over to
later.
I love it. So in the last 60 seconds, any parting comments or major points that you guys would like to raise? Please feel free. Dr. Shih, anything that you want to let folks know about?
The last thing I'll say really quickly is, I think people have touched on this. How do you evaluate the how a drug works? And I want to, this goes to my work with residents too, like to highlight that we all need to do a better job in residency training folks how to evaluate drugs, what they're intended to do. Read the label. The label contains information that was done in highly regulated studies. Papers are good, but actually they're not audited the way that FDA label clinical study information is. And then I think engage your senior mentors to actually talk and independently evaluate some of these studies that get published.
Sounds great. Dr. Southerland?
I would say for anybody who's out there, who's in residency or fellowship or even medical school, if this if you're here, then obviously this is something that's interesting to you. And so I would, if you don't know the pockets within your own department or your training program or your institution where there are folks that have relationships with industry, or either through research support or through clinical partnerships, go to your program director or your advisor and ask and say, who in our department is working with industry on something, because I'd like to learn more about that, and find a mentor in that sort of protected environment who can sort of open up that world to you, and that to me would be the best way to learn, and maybe that would develop into getting a scholarship or an award to a meeting, and maybe even something that would be instrumental to your career after training. And so that would be my advice, is to find those mentors and begin to learn from them.
Excellent idea. Dr. Schneider?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much to add to that. I think mentorship is the most important thing for any career development, and having somebody who can give you context and honest advice is the way to be able to explore whether or not this is something that you feel comfortable with or not. In the end, though, you always have your own decision. I have a colleague who always goes to the pharma drug company dinners, but never gets the dinner. She's like, I'm just not going to sign in. I'm not going to eat the food. And that's how she chooses to engage in both the MSL and the pharma world. But you only can know what you're comfortable with through exposure. And it's important to do it at a time where you can have somebody to bounce an idea off of and say, hey, I did this thing. What do you think? Or I think about this thing. And they can give you context and perspective. That's what residency training is helping you do. You're in a training capacity to learn. And sometimes it will be like, what is this door? What's hiding behind this door? Oh, okay, there's this thing I don't want to, let me shut that door. Or somebody can just say, that's the fire escape. Don't open that. That could be a problem, right? So you just need to have people who can give you context, and the best time to do it is when you're in training. We want to help you, and there are mentors who are comfortable with it and mentors who aren't. So if you're interested in this, ask a mentor who is, and they'll hopefully give you honest advice.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again to everybody for your time. I think that our Twitter handles or something will be posted, and folks will be able to continue to engage with us and continue the conversation. This has been very interesting and informative for me, and I'm sure for several others. Thank you to the AAN for allowing us the opportunity and this platform to have this discussion. And with that, I guess we'll close.
Yes, thank you so much for joining. And I just want to give a special shout out to Dr. Mahajan, who is the assistant professor of the Department of Neurological Sciences at Rush University. Dr. Mahajan was the leading physician who made these 5 very successful panels possible. And these webinars are recorded and will be on AAN YouTube as soon as possible. But thank you for joining us, and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.